Hi, everybody. My name is JD Allen. I'm from the Press Club of Long Island. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We are holding a little bit of a workshop as part of our monthly get-togethers that we have here on Zoom. We do have some in-person events as we're coming out of the pandemic. So do keep an eye on our email distribution and our social media. You can find out a whole lot more of that at Press Club of LI. Just about every social media outlet you can think of, and at gmail.com if you want to get in touch with us directly. These two gentlemen with me are Michael Davis and Mikhail Simmons. They both work for the Solutions Journalism Network. We're going to talk a little bit about what their network is in a little while. I'm a Long Islander. I work at WSHU Public Radio. I'm their managing editor. And Michael and Mikhail have been my mentors in really learning and understanding what solutions journalism is. So thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Great to be with you this evening.
Great to be with you all.
And so we're going to kind of take this as a very introductory step into what solutions journalism is. Okay, I didn't like. Okay, so today we're going to go through what solutions journalism is, why solution journalism is important, and why we should do it. And then we're going to talk about some techniques for how you can incorporate solutions journalism into your own work. So what is solutions journalism? Solutions journalism is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So you might be thinking, wait, I thought that's what journalism is. Well, yeah, those here that are practicing journalism, you are probably doing solutions journalism already without even knowing it. The solutions journalism that we're talking about today is that we're building the framework for how do we explain it to our peers in the newsroom who might be veterans of their craft, or emerging journalists that are trying to learn all of the tools and skills that they need in order to be a well-rounded reporter. And so I view solutions journalism as just another tool in the tool belt. Just like you might have the inverted pyramid when you are trying to get the news out and get the news out fast and break news in a news brief, solutions journalism is a tool that you can use for your own storytelling. Just like the inverted pyramid, where you have the most important idea on top, and then you have to have a quote that shows emotion, and then you have a nut graph that kind of gives the well-rounded context, insight to a story. Solutions journalism has its own framework for you to think about, not necessarily the order of things that you need to report on, but rather the elements of a story that you need to consider when trying to tell a solutions story. So solutions journalism covers a response to a problem and how it happens. So a lot of time news follows events, right? We cover events. Now, that is reactionary in the way that we are reporting. In this way, we're not necessarily talking about the coverage of an event. We're talking about, well, if the event is about childcare, if there's an event about more money for childcare centers, the response to the problem might be how funding is implemented to try to fix the problem, to follow the money, right? The phrase that we know in journalism, the thing that most of us into journalism, right, Michael?
Yes, sir.
And so we then follow that up with the second piece of the framework, which is to provide evidence of the impact of how effective the implementation of that plan was. And now this could be a plan in your neck of the woods. It could be something that your neck of the woods is considering, but is done elsewhere. And you are kind of comparing what was effective or ineffective elsewhere to what's happening and what is being considered by you. Mikhail, can you help me with an example?
Yeah, sure. A great example I would say is bail reform. Bail reform over the last decade has been being implemented in different ways. And by bail reform, I specifically mean not rethinking about how you just give bail to those who are going through the court system. And instead of writing and saying, hey, politician A loves bail reform, politician B hates bail reform, we can sit back and say, hey, this has been implemented in 3 different counties. What was the results? What were the results of that policy? Who did it help? Who did it not help? Did it actually work? Did it fail? When we're talking about evidence and focusing on the response, we're asking that you don't only cover a failed response and say, this is why it sucks and this is the evidence here. If something actually works, also tell that story too.
Yeah, the example I would think about immediately tonight is rising tides in coastal communities. Well, and there are a lot of places that are in peril, and some places that have been very flat-footed in doing things to respond to the threat. But we've found at the Solutions Journalism Network that there are all kinds of ideas in play, not only in the United States, but globally, on how to mitigate against this danger. And so, Solutions Journalism says, okay, you may not have an idea in play in your locale, but look outside your locale for examples of who's doing it better.
And so instead of telling the story, okay, here the criminal justice system is broken. Candidate A wants to reform the bail system this way. Candidate B says that's a bad idea. That's a story that we tell all the time. That's a story that might make sense in an election story. But when we're talking about the nuance of, well, what is bail reform? Does it mean the elimination of cash bail? Does it mean a reformed pre-court trial system? Does it mean services provided to prevent recidivism for violent or drug offenses? What does bail reform mean in this context? And where has it worked elsewhere? So going through that evidence of impact, whether in your neck of the woods or elsewhere, you can provide insights to how others have responded to a problem. We saw this as Long Islanders, especially over the last 7 years or so, when we talk about the Suffolk County septic program. It's been a very successful program in moving out old and worn out septic systems that is causing a large pollution problem in our waterways. And our solution, the program that the county developed to allow homeowners to get funding to help with the installation of new systems, that wasn't something that we dreamt up. When that program was being considered, there was reporting about how we were looking elsewhere, both in the Cape Cod region in Massachusetts, as well as the Chesapeake Bay region in Virginia. And so there was an opportunity there, and already reporting done by a lot of the news outlets by us about, okay, so what does this look like? And what did it look like elsewhere? So we're doing it already. It's also important to point out the limitations to what these responses could be. That helps 2 things. If you hear the word solutions and you think, that sounds like advocacy, we're not saying whether or not something is good or bad. That is not the job of a journalist. We're saying whether something worked or didn't work in our backyard or elsewhere, based on the evidence and based on how far that progress worked. And so if we're reporting on bail reform and something that might have worked in Chicago or New York City or LA, and we look at it as a statewide issue here in New York, we might determine that as New Yorkers are considering ways to change bail reform, here are the limitations to what people want and don't want, as well as what worked and what didn't. You have anything to add, Michael? Or
Yeah, the
Mikhail?
limitations are really important because, as you said, it kind of gives you a suit of armor against anyone who's saying, oh, you're just banging the drum for this program or this new idea that was initiated. It's not PR if you make a sustained effort to include the limitations of the response. And it could be as simple as with the septic system. Well, who did it help? But who was left out? Who was unable to get this help? And is the money going to run out? What are the other elements of the program that have limited the response? So just asking good repertorial questions about the idea in play. And Mikhail, I'm sure you can add to that.
Yeah, no response to a problem is a silver bullet. If someone says this thing solves all of the problems, like that's a red flag already. Even if it solves some of the problems, just tell the whole story about the response to the problem in its full effect or where it's ineffective as well.
So these four. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael.
No, I was just going to say, and you can't do this, JD, and everyone, unless and until people know what the problem is. You can't do solutions journalism. That's not a first day story. It has to be about something that your readers or listeners or viewers already know about in your community. Then you can do it.
So again, this is a tool to have in your tool belt. So if you take you can put in one pocket of that tool belt your inverted pyramid, in the other tool belt side pocket, you can put these four pillars. You're covering not a problem, right? Not the moment of conflict that makes your inverted pyramid work. You're covering the response to that problem and how it happened. You're giving the context. You're providing evidence to show, well, how effective has that response been or planned to have been? You can look at data for that. You can provide insights to how others have tried and either succeeded or failed in what is being talked about here. And you can also talk about what limitations those successes have had. And like Michael said, that buttons you up. That makes the reporting that you're doing more bulletproof to the to criticism that the work that you're doing is the nuance is getting in the way of storytelling, or that the approach that you're taking is too advertorial. You're not picking a side. You're exploring the motivations that those sides have. So what are we talking about here? This is not like, we're not focusing on theory. We're not focusing on, well, there's a lot of great research out there that points at stuff that we use as stories that drives our storytelling all the time in the newsroom, but we're not necessarily focusing on the theories that can inform our society. We are looking at how there is already progress that could be an example of that theory being distributed. So if we're talking about the theory of reducing crime and victimization in the public sector, we might look at progress in a community that is trying to, government showing grassroots efforts. We're not talking about one-stop shops of silver bullet solutions that if the community adopts this idea, that all of the problems are going away. We're going to explore, how much of the problem will be solved or could be solved with the funding that was just announced. We're talking about the implementation of that funding. We are making sure that the response to a problem is the core element of the story. That's important. A lot of journalism starts and ends with conflict. We're acknowledging that conflict exists. It's still a news driver, but it's not without people already doing something or acknowledging the problem existing and trying to work and cope with it. I would really like Michael or Mikhail, if you could pick up on this, because as we start to approach the midterm election, and hopefully the folks in this room, as they're thinking about solutions journalism, the idea of partisanship, it might be a reason why a newsroom wouldn't want to approach solutions journalism. Well, if I'm trying to exploit what a candidate is saying is going to work or not work, does that make me working for the other side, Mikhail?
Not at all. I mean, I don't see why you can't apply that across the board. Politicians will come and say, I promise that if we apply this housing policy, we will get 5,000 more homes. Like, we as journalists could say, okay, this policy hasn't been applied somewhere else. Is this the number of homes we're going to get? That is just holding them accountable to the thing they are promising or the thing they're saying. A lot of times when we cover elections, there's a disconnect between process and goals. And using solution journalism, you could really investigate those processes and say, hey, we spoke to the experts, we spoke to the people on the ground. This is or is not, or may not get us to the goal. And here's the evidence of how it has been applied multiple times across the country or states or county or school district. Again, this doesn't all have to be national. Sometimes a valid response is happening in your backyard.
You would never do solutions journalism about a campaign promise. You would do solutions journalism only about something that exists today, that you can measure today. You're looking for the effectiveness of something that is in play. So, I mean, if a politician is representing that, you can examine that through a solutions lens. But it's never about the future. It's always about the here and now.
Correct.
So it's really interesting because as we're taking a look at some promises made in New York about like rebate programs like child tax credits and stuff like that, it might be an opportunity where sure, there might be more Democrats versus Republicans that might support a rebate program like that, where you could look at the success or failure rate of places like Connecticut or New Jersey that already have had those types of programs, or even stimulus rollouts during the pandemic, and whether or not putting a few $100s back into parents' pockets really does make a difference that month. And so while we were taking a campaign or a political issue, we're really saying not are the Dems right or are the Republicans right? We're saying, does this mechanism that people are talking about in this campaign, could it work? We were just talking about something really important, right? We're talking about things that are being considered in the midterms. One of the pitfalls that I hear from within my own newsroom and others that we collaborate when we start talking about solutions journalism is that, well, I'm not looking for a puff piece. I'm not looking for a piece about, a couple of do-gooders or a hero within a community that is trying to make the world a better place. Newsflash, we do those stories, right? Those are, in the news all the time. Instead, we're looking for community solutions where groups of people are trying to implement change to address problems, and how are those replicated in different communities? So while you might dismiss a story as hero worship, we're really talking about communities responding to problems, and not just here, but elsewhere. So does, just like to rattle off a few, does composting work? Does composting work in really complex geographical conditions? Mike, what are some other community programs that might be looked at like this?
Yeah, I wanted to say here to just underscore something you brought up, that it's never a story about a single individual, a hero or a heroine. There's room in the world for those kinds of stories, and I watched that CNN thing at the end of the year about, American heroes, and I cried like a baby, I love it. But that's not solutions journalism. Solutions journalism focuses on an entity, a county, a city. It's about systemic change. It's not about an individual doing something. It's about a group of individuals representing, an ensemble, coming up with an idea and putting it in play. So that's a very important piece of this. It's never about a person. Our people in solutions journalism stories, we think of them as like characters. They drive the story, but they're not one person is not the single focus of the story.
The probably my favorite phrase when I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this a lot since the pandemic, because all of our brains collectively shifted a little bit in our newsrooms when we thought about what do people in our community need to know about the pandemic, right? We followed the money. We were making sure that the money that we were getting was going into the products that we needed to survive. And we followed the distribution of vaccines, and we followed the successfulness of PPP. We did the watchdog stuff. I'm not saying we're not doing watchdog. Watchdog is very important. But we also did a lot of work as guide dogs. We did a lot of work of bringing people resources and services and real things, real information that can help create change in a community. In this case, remaining healthy. This is an example underneath the guide dog reference of a story. I think it's I'm having trouble remembering the outlet.
Cleveland Plain Dealer.
Thank you. And they looked into policies outside of their city about lead poisoning, and what strategies were being used elsewhere that weren't being used in their city. And so after a series of work where they did really great watchdog journalism, they also had resources for what are different facets that parents, schools, community leaders, politicians, public works people could do to make things just a little bit better in each area. And this really matters because when we're writing a story, we're thinking about the audience. In this situation, this story, they were guiding an entire community for, hey, lead's really making our kids sick and killing them. How could we do a little bit more to prevent that?
Yeah, this particular series is such a great example of looking outside your area. The Cleveland Plain Dealer went to like-sized cities throughout the Northeast and simply asked, well, how did you address this problem? And this is such a great example of accountability journalism, because when they brought back specifics about what other like-sized cities were doing and presented it to the elected officials in Cleveland, it put a Bunsen burner under their behinds. These were people who were saying, well, there's nothing more we can do about it. Can't throw good money after bad, all those stupid cliches. And they went out and they discovered that there were effective, cost-effective strategies that could be adopted in Cleveland. And so a lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of legislation was passed in Ohio as a result of this good work.
What I love about, just as I say, about that example is they asked a simple question: who had this problem and doesn't have it anymore? Right? Simple question that got them down a rabbit hole of solution stories. And they realized one of the most effective ways to stop lead poisoning in kids was to test homes before kids got sick, not after. That didn't take more money. They had all the information already. The cities that were doing that had the data set. They knew where schools were, they knew where the kids were, they know how old the housing stuff was. Not $1,000, just change your process. And that's what I like about it, because it removed that question of a lot of money. You need to throw a lot of money at this. It's like, no, it's a process change. That makes such a big difference.
So we just talked about kind of like the comparison of like what it is and what it's not, or what it is and how do we, what it was and how do we build on the skills that we have as journalists to do kind of journalism through a different framework. So why are we doing this in the first place? Well, I started getting involved more with the Solutions Journalism Network a few years ago, pretty much right before the pandemic started. I think Mikhail was my first person that I heard come into my newsroom and started talking about solutions. So if any of you don't like this, it's his fault. We started with a really simple, with a really with an introduction to like what this is, and we were skeptical. I got to be honest, we were really skeptical because we didn't know how to put it into use. We saw this framework and we said, yeah, but we know how to do journalism. We've been doing journalism all this time. And then Mikhail said something to me. He goes, all right, so instead of doing a whole big series or a whole big, 3,000 word feature that like you are finding all the responses and finding all the limitations, just like when you're doing an interview or you're putting together a story, ask yourself the question, do I have evidence here? Is my story just pointing to the problem? Or is it acknowledging that there are people responding to the problem? Have you been able to determine that what people are saying is going to save the day really might not go as far? Are there limitations there? Is anybody else doing it better? Can you give that insight? And when I realized I was already including some of those in my analysis, right? I was already including some of that in my reporting. And so in the beginning of 2021, I started a brand new podcast called Higher Ground that focused on climate change on Long Island. And we've done other panels that involved the podcast, so I'm not going to go on about it. But there are a lot of infrastructure problems that are decades old, centuries old on Long Island. That we've heard time and time again, storm after storm after storm, about, how there are going to be huge systemic things that we need to change and a lot of money, and we have improved since Hurricane Sandy, which was 10 years ago. But how did we come up with those ideas? Did we just raise our homes because we got a lot of money thrown at us? Does that work? Has it worked elsewhere? What about really, really like huge policy changes like coastal retreat? Has it been done somewhere? Does it work? And so this is not by any means a solutions podcast. I don't even know if that is a branded name at all. I'm sorry, Michael or Mikhail. This by no means is a solutions podcast, but we started to ask a lot of those solutions journalism pillar type questions, while doing this podcast. Are we taking for granted the solutions that government told us would work, or that the money told us would work? And I think that the podcast came out the way that it came out, and good in my opinion, because we were able to tell a different narrative about the response to natural disasters. Your newsrooms are likely already doing solutions journalism around climate change. I should preference, I'm a climate journalist, so I do a lot of environmental stuff. So that's why a lot of my analogies might come from there. But you are probably doing a lot of work around solutions journalism when it comes to climate change, because you recognize that you're either doing a story that says we're all going to die and there's nothing we can do, or there's something we can do, so let's explore what all those things are. And so we're finding things that are big and small. A lot of Long Island newsrooms, you've done versions of these stories about the power of shellfish in our waters and how kelp can remediate our pollution problem. These are stories that we consume all the time. We've got a really rich wine country. That's really hard to say. Really rich wine country on Long Island. There are stories that takes a look at what's growing here and what might not be able to be grown here in 10, 20, 30 years. We see it in our programming. John Oliver's been doing a lot of stuff that, yes, has journalism and entertainment in it, and it drives me crazy with my students at Stony Brook when they bring this to the table as something that is purely journalism. But we're consuming it in many different ways, and we're consuming it in ways that are very important in national conversations about the materials that are available to our kids in classrooms and in public spaces like libraries, when we're considering criminal justice reform, when we're talking about outbreaks like monkeypox in really vulnerable communities like the LGBT community, and around discussions about homelessness. So by issue, we're doing it already. It's just if you're going to take something away from this meeting, it's that you're already doing solutions journalism. You now know what the secret is. You have the framework. Think about that framework the same way you would say, what's the most important thing that I need to lead with? For any of the editors in the room and folks that manage the publications, I was hoping Michael and Mikhail can take us through a little bit of the data about how solutions journalism is something that your readers, viewers, and listeners actually want to consume.
Sure, Michael, you want me to jump in, or do you want to jump in?
Yeah, you jump, then I'll jump in after you.
Okay. JD, I'm going to throw you off a little bit. I'm going to talk about the big picture here and get to the slides. Okay. So taking a step back, where JD started the section asking, why do solutions journalism? Like, why should we do it? Our audiences have news fatigue, quite frankly. The world is going to end. There's nothing we could do about it. This sucks, that other thing you liked, yeah, that sucks too. And that has turned audiences off. And there's lots of research on that from Reuters Institute, Oxford, on and on and on. Why? What the data has shown us from the first slide he showed us from Texas University. I saw you skip through some other slides. All of the research institutions are on the bottom because we're journalists, so we like to say this is where we got our sources. What they show us is that audiences want more of this type of reporting. They don't have a word for it because why would they? We just have a word for it. But they don't want to feel like they're bombarded by negativity in the world, especially when some audiences, quite frankly, see things going better. For example, infant mortality was getting better pre-pandemic, right? The reporting would never tell you that. Malnutrition was going down, again, for 20 years straight. Reporting didn't show that. What this reporting does when it's on your page, it helps audiences get a better view of the world. What the data has shown us is more time on page from audiences. What the data has shown us is, in some cases, more or better engagement. What the data has shown us is that these stories, when the headline is done well, Peter, to rope in your question, when the headline is done well, it taps people's curiosity and they're more likely to jump into the story, as opposed to, hey, I know the world sucks and I'm going to keep on moving because the headline tells me it sucks. Or the headline tells me it's too good to be true. Michael, do you want to jump in? I don't.
Yeah, the constant barrage of problem stories and stories that talk about this crisis and this crisis and this crisis and that crisis, it leads to a feeling of helplessness among news consumers, and that's what the data shows. And when people feel helpless and afraid, they're not receptive to ideas. When you do solutions journalism well, and you show them that some people are making progress against a problem, they lean forward. They actually pay more attention. And the brain science behind all of this is that we are more capable of accepting and judging and evaluating ideas when we are not feeling helpless, we were not feeling scared, or feeling like, as Mikhail said, like the world's coming to an end. So a lot of it just sort of makes sense. The bottom line is that the research that we've done and then others have done about our work tends to show that your audiences are like crying for this. They want to feel like climate change is not some huge problem that you can't begin to address. They want to they want some hope, but we call solutions journalism hope with teeth. You know, this is just good reporting, good journalism that can lead your readers to feel a little hopeful about and small but measurable advances in societal problems.
We're used to measuring in the newsroom metrics that are usually driven by people getting pissed, right? When we look at engagement and we look at social media engagement, right, we're looking at how many times things were shared, what's the comments like, what are the referrals like, and a lot of those are caused by anger, right? We see that. What a lot of this research looks at is that stories that have solution journalism in mind are talked about, and shared just as much, if not more. If I'm not, and the reason being is because you're getting to what people are most interested in. You're getting them to lean in. You're getting them to engage with not the conflict, but you're getting them to engage with reflection of, is this a response that works for my community? So if your job as a journalist is to inform, you're actually doing a better job.
And at a minimum, when you do this work well, you can change the conversation in town at a minimum, right? You do the good reporting, and you're writing about a problem that's been around for a long time. And what you find is once people read this and digest this and start thinking about it, the conversation does change. Now, whether your elected leaders and other leaders in your community do something about it, I mean, that we don't propel that, but it's makes you feel so good as a reporter. And I've been a reporter since the Paleozoic age. It makes you feel so good to be the messenger of this kind of work, especially when it's a thorny issue that's been in the community for a really long time and people feel like they're stuck and there's no answer. If you can do the reporting that shows that somebody else facing the very same problem has come up with an idea and you bring it back, you become a very different kind of messenger as a journalist. And you'll find that Mikhail can back me up on this, that the response that you get, on social media and through comments it's very different than the kind of response that you get from the everyday problem story.
Yeah, I'd just like to add before JD goes on, and I know we'll touch on this later. Solutions journalism is not in and of itself a silver bullet. I know we just talked about increase in time on page, different types of conversation. Those examples, and you can go through the research, were part A/B testing. Some of those newsrooms did sustained coverage. Some of those newsrooms thought about how they did their headlines. So there's a lot of nuance you could talk about execution, but I just want to be clear. This is not the thing that's you're going to do it and it's going to solve all of your journalism problems. There's no silver bullet solution to every problem. This is what solution journalism solves for, is an inaccurate view of the world, or a tainted mirror of the world where we only cover failures as journalists, or disproportionately cover failures at times, which makes sense. There's a fire, something's wrong, you should watch out for this. But we don't cover responses to those failures, far less successful responses. When we do a full reporting of the world, we have a better idea of what actually is possible and what are the options. So it solves for one aspect of journalism. JD?
Yeah, it's just about reframing. It's just about, as a climate journalist, and when I'm looking at solutions, instead of reporting on how heat waves are going to make our densest communities more unsafe. That's an important story, and I might still do that story. But if I'm working on a series of work and I'm really focusing on that, I might focus on mitigation. How do we lessen the effects of this? There is work being done, like increasing tree canopy and making available recreational for youth to be able to cool off during the summer to mitigate those bad health effects. I might find stories about adaptation, right? Instead of just death or sickness, I'm finding adaptation. How do we find replacements to what we have right now? If putting an AC in every house is not going to be realistic, what about a community center where people might be able to cool off? Is there a replacement that we can focus on? Is there resilience that I can focus on in my reporting, right? These are different news drivers than the magnitude of people getting sick. I'm looking for the resilience of how do we cope with climate change or this symptom of climate change. Am I looking for systems that have a multi-layered problem to them? Is there an infrastructure challenge that makes it difficult for us to see that there is a response to this problem, right? That goes back to the lead conversation that we were having earlier. So it's really just about kind of changing the mindset that you have in finding what a story is. We're not looking for the typical news drivers of conflict, prominence, proximity, the things that catch our eyes. So we might identify an issue or a question that's of concern when we're doing our reporting, when we're trying to figure out, well, what is a solution story in my neighborhood? We might ask what's missing or what are we not hearing about, right? If we're talking and we have a lot of news stories about young people getting sick from heat waves, what are we not hearing about? Are we not hearing about mitigation strategies, adaptation, resilience? Where can we start searching for the answer to that question? Where do we find what's missing? Right, Mikhail, this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about is there awareness, right? Is there awareness that that there's a problem that's being responded to?
Yeah, definitely. It's if you as a newsroom or a reporter, you've reported on a problem for days, months, weeks, years, and you think your audience understands the problem, that's a perfect time to do a solutions journalism piece, right? You can say, okay, we know what the problem is. What does a better response look like? And you don't need to go into deep 10,000 words or a minute and a half into a long radio piece explaining the problem. This is a problem, we all know it because we're stuck in traffic every day. Done, you understand the problem. The rest of your time can be focused on a response and the effectiveness of that response. My favorite example of that is a story that's like 575 words, and it's about bed bugs in New York. And it's like, bed bugs are bad. This is what New York is doing about it. And the rest is just all 4 pillars, what New York has tried, the level of effectiveness, its limitations, and that's it. It didn't have to spend time on the problem. But if the problem is unknown to your audience, I say take the time to tell that story because they need to understand what the problem is, the nature of the problem, why it exists, especially when you're covering a multicultural or multi-ethnic or multi-demographic community. Not everyone understands the problems that may be plaguing different communities. So you may want to take the time and say, this is the nature of this problem. Now, let's talk about how people are responding to this specific problem on the ground or how others have responded and what we can learn from.
So I'm just watching our time. If you're trying to answer that question, where am I trying to find, these to responses to problems? Are there groups like universities or think tanks or innovation networks that are looking to solutions? I mean, if you go back a couple of years and you think about renewable energy, I mean, there were stories all over Long Island that we were reporting on that fit into this category. We still are. Are there large data sets that we can look at that can help inform whether or not there is progress being made in trying to alleviate a problem? You can check out some of the others that are here, and we're going to talk a little bit about in a moment what Michael and Mikhail do at the Solutions Journalism Network and some resources there that could also help you figure out who's doing it better. we're going to skip a couple of slides because I'm just watching our time and I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. I do just want to pause on this slide. We talked about it earlier. And it kind of goes into the way of like, okay, so if you were to kind of reframe your thinking here, I gave you how I now think about climate stories with mitigation, adaptation, resilience. Instead of covering an announcement, right? Hochul is always making announcements. Malone is always making announcements. You know, how are plans implemented? How do we see these plans being carried through? And are we checking up on these plans being carried through? Instead of the concept or idea of maybe we should come up with this plan on a legislative level, what is the action being done to help people find homes or to feed their families? If we have a really oversimplified solution, if this one thing people say is going to solve our problems, how do we break down the complexity of that really simple solution into a more nuanced story? And if there's one person who is being viewed as the hero of a story, you know, what is the community that supports that person? Because they just might be the face of a much larger operation that is a much more interesting story, right? I mean, it exists in our cliches. It takes a village, right? But it also helps you stay in the realm of journalism, right? It helps you avoid PR by painting the whole picture. Before we go on to what Solutions Journalism Network is, do you guys want to add anything about looking for characters?
Yeah, sure. I would say, just to clarify, looking for characters in your story. That's what do you mean?
Looking for characters in your story.
Yeah, sure. I would simply say this, like, these are some of the same characters the same way you find characters for a problem-focused story, the same way you find characters for a solution story, right? Who's most affected? Who's trying to do something about it? What does the data say? Who's on the ground? Are there any critiques of a response, whether the response is governmental or local or community or NGO based? You know, those are the people you should be talking to. That's just the broadest sense, because you can get a story. You can do this in any topic, quite frankly. And whatever your beat is, think about the characters you want to have, or ask the experts and just follow them, right? Who's implementing this? Who's most affected by this? Just follow that line the same way you follow a line of a problem story.
Cool.
And I would say, you know, in your story, have a person who's being served by the response, and make sure that you find a person who, for whatever reason, is not being served by the response. And make sure that you include, you know, a paragraph about critics of the response. Very important.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll just say, JD, just a note, valid criticism. Some people are just haters. I don't like this. Why? Bar humbug. Like, that's not helpful to anybody, right? Valid criticism.
But we find the bah humbugs all the time, and we quote the bah humbugs all the time because we know that they're going to call back. But so it's moving beyond the person that we know it's going to call back, that it might just be towing the party line, and finding somebody who has made the decision with the information that they have to be a critic. That's very important. So I want to make sure that there's enough time for some questions, but I do want to give you guys a moment to just talk about your network, because I have found that having mentors like you and having some professional development, right? We are all here as part of PCLI and SPJ for professional development networking. And these are two folks who are, well, Michael's not in your neck of the woods, but Mikhail is, who are very accessible and can help offer just a continuing learning environment for you, your classroom, and your newsroom through their network.
Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. Solutions journalism has been around about 8 years as an institution. It was started by a trio of journalists with very high bona fides who just felt that we were in danger of creating a generation that wasn't getting the whole story. And it just happens that these journalists had done a lot of work and researching emerging ideas globally, and shared those ideas with their audiences in book form. And so it came from a sincere place of concern about journalism. And so through the years, it's grown in number and grown in in its basic aim to kind of reframe journalism and to get people thinking about not concentrating only on the watchdog aspect. We're never going to say that the watchdog aspect isn't the very important and central to what we do. We're just saying solutions journalism can help you tell the whole story. There's, if you're going to do a big investigative series, please give some thought to adding a fifth part about response to the problem that you are investigating. Mikhail?
Sure,
Right,
and I would say, oh, go ahead, JD.
So in terms of like being a journalist and being an editor and being a professor, when I look at the Solution Journalism Network, I'm looking for ways to reach different audiences, right? I'm looking for ways to build on what I already know. I'm looking for a network of people that I can find resources from. Mikhail.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and that's what our goal is. As Michael said, what happened at our founding was codifying solutions journalism, right? It existed in some form sporadically, and we said, okay, we see a thing that's missing, we have to give it a name, and naming a thing helps us tackle. What we do at SJN our goal is to have more solution journalism in the world. That's it. That's our primary goal. Everything we do is to have more and high quality solution journalism. So we do that by working with news organizations, by working with journalism schools. We've created online resources such as toolkits and webinars and learning labs. They are all free to access. So this is just, hey, we want more of this. You can access it yourself. You don't even need to have a chat with me, but feel free to reach out. We also try to build communities of practice, and that can look different in different places. It could be a number of newsrooms collaborating together. It could be students working together. It could be news organizations working with libraries. It doesn't matter. It's really about groups of people who want to practice and say, we want to have more of this in it.
Sure. I'm working with 15 climate journalists from across the world right now through Solutions Journalism, so they can help me and help inform the work that I'm doing about climate stories on Long Island. And so it means that as I'm going through my investigation, I say, hey guys, I'm having a really tough time trying to envision what limitations to this are. And then I'm hearing from photographers and data experts that are all part of this this cohort, that are also journalists that are doing their own work. And we can kind of feed off of each other to better our reporting.
Yeah, and I will just add quickly. Oh, sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead, Mikhail.
Yeah, no, and I'll add quickly. We also curate a thing we call the Story Tracker, which is a database of solution stories from all over the world. And just dive in, do a quick Google, do a quick search in the search bar, and I recommend looking for a topic you think there's no one responding to. Like if you're like, there's nothing we can do for X, type in that topic, and chances are you'll see a few stories about people responding to that problem and the level of effectiveness that's there. And I would say, as journalists, as editors, it's a really powerful tool to see how this is done in different platforms, in different geographies, different lengths, whether it's done by journalism students or professionals who've been in the world of journalism for 40, 50 years. It's a really good database that's free to use and just search around.
Right, and there are stories from print journalism, legacy journalism, radio journalism, television journalism, all kinds of examples in there. And It's a great reporter's tool because number one, if you're looking for sourcing about a particular topic, if you're looking for people to call and talk to, you'll be able to find them within the stories on the tracker. Number two, if you're dry on story ideas, it is a marvelous tool for, frankly, taking stories that have been done elsewhere and localizing them and putting your own spin on them.
Yeah,
I
there's something being done on the other side of the US. What does that mean for me, right? I mean, you guys were probably in the same journalism classes that I were, that we used to open up the USA Today, go to the national section and say, how would we do this story here? That's basically what you can do using the Solutions Journalism Tracker. And I know there are a couple other educators in the room. I use this tracker all the time to bring examples into my classroom of stories that, of different kinds and of different mediums that can illustrate, the different type of best practices to use, or even it's a lot of fun to take these stories that we recognize as good solution stories and poke holes in them, because they're not perfect, they're not, but they are a good selection of stories that focus on these pillars.
And if you are a little hazy after a few weeks or months about solutions journalism, going to the tracker and reading some of the stories will immediately refresh you about the 4 pillars.
Mikhail, we have the hub here, and we also have the learning lab, if you just want to kind of lump them together for me so we can get to some questions.
Yeah, so I'll just speed through and say these are we actually updated the website. So if you go to the website, the design will be a little different, just FYI. Yeah, we try to connect freelancers with editors. We try to connect editors with other editors or producers with editors. The hub is just the journalists who work with us, who are trying to do solution journalism, interacting with each other, sometimes, many times independent of us, which we think is great. We don't have to be the center of this. We actually, in many ways, don't want to be the center of this. We want to facilitate networks inside and outside.
It's great for emerging journalists or freelance reporters that have ideas for stories but don't know where to pitch. This is an example of what you might do with, say, a capstone project coming out of college, or a story that you are really dedicated to, but you haven't found a buyer yet as a freelancer.
Yeah, and the toolkits we have are all to help you practice solution journalism, answer questions you may have, tons of examples. We have toolkits focused on health, focused on violence, toolkits specifically for editors. So it's just many toolkits that are built to help you practice solution journalism, whichever way makes sense. And the basic toolkit, the 101, comes in multiple languages, and we're always trying to expand our linguistic reach.
All right, so I'm going to stop the share so we can get to some questions. If you'd like, you can put some questions in the chat. I might call on you if you're able to join us with your camera, if you're in a place where you can do that, or at least join us with your voice. For the time being, if you like programs like this, you can sign up for the Press Club of Long Island's mailing list to receive recordings of this event and future announcements. There's a link in the chat. You can also email pressclubofli@gmail.com. Any questions about kind of like intro to solutions journalism, or for Michael or Mikhail about the network?
Or any dissenting voices. We'd love to get clarity on those as well.
I'm sorry?
No, I said any dissenting voices.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, I have questions still, or I don't like this because.
While everybody's thinking, I just want to say that this works on any beat, including sports. And it's handy on that day when you are at a story meeting and sort of one of those stories comes along that happens all the time, and you're looking for a fresh way to get at it. Just asking the question, I wonder who's doing it better, can give you a follow idea that you might not have gotten if you had not asked that question.
Basically, I just want to say, I think this is really interesting. the class that that is watching it right now is a class about editing, and this is a very interesting framework to use if you're looking for stories. You know, this is something that is, and I think that's important for editors to think about, not just reporters, because the editors are the ones who are going to frame the way something is going to be covered. Another thing about this that I think is pretty valuable is that it's not about conflict. You know, a lot of journalism is about conflict. This is not about conflict. This is actually about, because it's about solution, it tends to be, they couldn't be more positive stories. You're more likely to get more cooperation from your sources if it's clear that what you're doing is trying to say, here are people who are doing something to improve the situation. So I like that about this. Not a question, just a comment.
When we're doing this, Peter, we're more like engineers than we are lawyers. You know, lawyers are combat, engineers are always thinking about, well, how can you make it better? How can you make this work? So one way to look at it. I saw Brendan's note in the chat about how you would respond to an ordinary journalist who said we just stick to straight news. My tender response to that person would be, because the audience wants it. Your readers, your viewers, your listeners are asking for this. They're the people who keep us in business. They have a vested interest in the news. They're news consumers. And our research shows that we're fulfilling a need that has gone not entirely unmet, but largely unmet.
I would answer that question a little differently. Straight news is one of those terms where one person would define it one way and another person would define it another way, right? If I define straight news as factual information that's happening right now that's relevant to my audience, solutions journalism should be in there. No questions asked, right? But if I define straight news as what's going wrong, well, you will not see solutions journalism in that mix at all. So I think when we say the word or the phrase straight news, we should really define what we mean. Because if we read out our definition, we may realize it is not counter to solution journalism. It is accurate. And if someone says it is our job to focus on the negative, if that's their definition of straight news, I would say beyond the point Michael made about it being a problem, when you talk about a problem in X community and you leave, your audience only knows about the problems in that community, right? So you could grow up in Suffolk County and people will be like, yeah, that neighborhood over there is always bad because I grew up with it being bad. The school system there sucks. If the school system got better over 20 years when you went off to college and you moved off somewhere and you came back, you would never know. As far as you're concerned, your idea of that community is still bad because the last news you got about it, straight news, was that it sucks. And your biases are built on that. So when we only focus on the negative and I don't tell the full story, we actually cause harm by leaving out information. And then we should not be surprised when our audiences have these biases because we quite frankly told them, right? We told them it sucks over there, there's nothing good over there, end of discussion. We never have to come back. So we also have to think about what we leave out when it comes to, as Peter mentioned, editorial choices, because that has a very real world effect as well, because we see that real world effect right now.
Yep. This is anecdotal evidence, not empirical, but I just tend to find that millennials totally get this. Younger people totally understand when you don't have to tell them twice. And they kind of look at you like, what's taken us so long to get to this point where we report on responses to problems? I don't know if you're finding that with your classes, JD, or not, but that's been my experience.
Peter, doing a quick straw poll, the folks that you can see, what's the response that you find from your students?
Well, we haven't talked about it. We haven't discussed this issue that had, we'll be talking about it, I think, later on. I would like to make a response to this comment from Brendan about sticking to straight news. Short response, well, this is a second day story. This is a follow. This is a feature. This is not, straight news is hard news, something that just happened. This is beyond that. This is following. This is building from the thing that just happened.
It could
And
also
I,
it could also even be, Peter, a once you get your brief out there, you're talking about the problem of systemic fires in old homes in the community, and you start to question, well, there needs to be something done about our old housing stock. That's when you start to tilt, wait a minute, well, so what's the response to that? Right? It's almost like you're opening yourself up for that kind of reporting. And Michael, from what you were saying before, it's also really telling that some of the faces that I can see here, and then some of the names that I know that came in and out of this meeting, there are a lot of young people that are more engaged in, whether they call it solutions journalism or not, but recognize that conflict cannot be the be all and end all of telling and informing, doing our job. There's a lot of interests in my classrooms, and Peter, there might be more in yours. Your editing class might
we'll
turn
find out.
Yeah. Are there any other questions before we wrap up for the night?
I'd just like to make a quick statement about the conflict part as well. If there was a place with conflict and it's no longer deep in that conflict, that might be a solution story as well, by the way. Like, it's really all well and good to say these two places are fighting because of X. But when they stop fighting, we don't tell that story. It's like, okay, all right, cool. Like, no, tell the story about how they stopped fighting, why they stopped fighting. Can we learn anything from it or not? Because bet your bottom dollar, that's useful for other communities in some form about how to get over their deep conflicts as well.
Very cool.
I would encourage everyone to try this. Give it a try, and see what it feels like. Get behind the wheel, take it for a spin, see what you think, see what the response is. It is one of those things that you get better at it the more you do it. That's for certain. And then if you do it for a long time, you'll get like me, where I've had this complete flip in my mind that, like, when I read the Sunday New York Times, I'm always thinking, this is such a great story, but only if they had only taken that next step and written about the response to this problem, would have been so much more satisfying. You kind of develop a taste for this and an urge for it, and you see the good that can come and the worlds that open up to you as a reporter when you do this. I'm writing a sequel to a book that I wrote in 2009, and the sequel is going to superimpose solutions journalism principles and practices, and it's going to be a much better book as a result.
And thank you both so much for joining PCLI tonight. We really appreciate it. If you want to know more about solutions journalism, you can go check out their website. For Long Islanders on the call, the co-founder of Solutions Journalism Network is actually going to be giving an in-person speech at Stony Brook University next week on Thursday, October 6th. PCLI, the Press Club of Long Island, is holding their next event on October 13th at 7 p.m. It's a TV news writing workshop with Bob Dotson. And the PCLI is planning to bring back the Long Island Journalism Hall of Fame for a Q&A at Hofstra University on November 14th. So please save the date. Thank you folks so much for joining us. Have a great night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.